Welcome. Hi, I'm Mikki, and this is Mikkipedia, where I sit down and chat to doctors, professors, athletes, practitioners, and experts in their fields related to health, nutrition, fitness, and well-being. And I'm delighted that you're here. Hello everyone, it's Mikki here, and you are listening to Mikkipedia. This week on the podcast, I speak to Ty Beal, Research Advisor on the Knowledge Leadership Team at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, or GAIN, about nutrient density, bioavailability, and his recent study on global micronutrient deficiencies. Ty talks about his approach to defining nutritional deficiencies and addresses common misconceptions and misunderstandings about which foods are the most nutrient dense. We discuss the modern diet, how children are impacted by the available food choices, the problem of nutrient deficiencies in the developed world, where calories are plentiful, and the challenge of establishing food guidance systems to address the health of the population, rather than a quote-unquote healthy population, of which most of the developed world wouldn't fall into. Ty is a research advisor on the Knowledge Leadership Team at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, and in his role he supports programs, research, evaluation, and dissemination of knowledge to stakeholders. He has an extensive experience base examining sustainable food systems, diet quality, food affordability, food supplies, micronutrient deficiencies, child growth and development, non-communicable diseases, and global health. He obtained a PhD in geography with an emphasis in global nutrition from the University of California in Davis, where he was a National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellow. And I've put links to Ty's ResearchGate, where you can find all of his publications, and a link to where you can find him at GAIN. Before we crack on into the episode, I'd just like to remind you that the best way you can support the podcast is to hit subscribe and leave us a review on your favourite podcast platform. That way, Mikkipedia gets a lot more visibility and more people are able to learn from the experts who generously give up their time to speak to me. That would be amazing. Outside of that, you could also jump on my website, MikkiWilliden.com, sign up to my recipe portal. For $12 a month, you get access to a regularly updated recipe library, you get tools to plan your own meals, you get access to me to answer your nutrition and health related queries, and you get my weekly emails. It's pretty cheap, to be honest, and that's another great way that you can support the podcast. All right, team, for now though, please enjoy this conversation I have with Ty Beal. Dr. Ty Beal, thank you so much for taking the time to chat to me today about micronutrient deficiency and requirements and, of course, your research. I would love to first get just you to do a little bit of an intro about yourself and also your educational path, because as I understand, it's quite a mix of geography and nutrition, ecology and epidemiology and all of that stuff.
Sure. Thanks for having me on, Mikki. It's great to be here. I had a very unusual start, although I think a lot of people have unusual starts to their careers. I was really focused on music and music production when I started getting into nutrition and geography, kind of out of the blue. But I had sort of interest in outdoors and backpacking and camping, as well as this sort of like gardening, food production, and then I kind of was working on my own health issues regarding nutrition. So I made some changes to my diet and really improved my health. I was like, this is pretty powerful. I want to learn more, I want to dig deeper, but I was not really sure which area to focus in. And I ended up pursuing a degree in geography at UC Davis, which happened to have a program in international and global nutrition. So it just kind of fit perfectly with what I was interested in. I was able to do an emphasis in the global nutrition department. And it's really broad. So we're covering things at UC Davis with agriculture, with ecology, with nutrition, with epidemiology, So really got exposed to a lot of different fields.
Because as I sort of look at your research and have heard you talk on podcasts, you have quite a broad systems approach to thinking about food, which I feel is sometimes lost in the conversation around nutrition. I think like connecting the dots, I think people don't have that knowledge or that background, whereas I feel that I mean, obviously that's the area that you sort of work in. So I feel like your education must have informed a lot of that.
Yeah, I think there hasn't really been historically much education or programs that are focused on this really comprehensive approach to food systems. That's probably changing now. So people who entered this area come from some sort of background. Maybe it's nutrition, maybe it's on the environment side, and then they pick up the other information knowledge to some degree throughout their career. And and that happened to me to some degree, but I did actually have formal training in lots of these different areas. So it gave me some advantage, I think, to have that perspective. But also, like, I have some expertise in certain areas, but I'm not, a lot of what I do is sort of synthesis of some different fields and different information. So it's really working with the right partners who are experts in key areas to fill the gaps and not having to know all the answers myself, of course.
For sure. Ty, you mentioned your sort of own personal nutrition issues sort of got you interested in nutrition. Where did you get that sort of original information from?
Yeah, so I just did it on my own. I started listening to some podcasts, I read some blogs, and then I started getting into some research, but I didn't read as much of the scientific literature at first. It was more of this sort of, Google searches, web searches, and then listening to different voices on nutrition, who had podcasts. So I listened to a variety of people, but main thing that I did, I kind of experimented on myself and tried to follow what kind of felt right, what worked. And interestingly, when I began researching, a lot of that, it informed my research, but I would always try to have this sort of perspective of, oh, I heard this on a podcast, or I read this in a blog. I'm going to look at the data myself because, of course, there's a lot of perspectives out there. There's a lot of pretty extreme views. And I think it's really important to just really sense check everything and also look at the data for yourself. And that's what I've tried to move towards is really my experience is important. But when you look at evidence and you're looking at public health, trying to guide populations, that's just one, right? It's just one tiny factor, and it's not going to inform really the evidence around what should we do at a population level.
Yeah, and I find it really interesting, and I know that we'll likely get into this, but you've got like public health food guidance or like guidelines. And I often wonder whether if people were able to stick to the guidelines, because they often get slammed, like the guidelines for being the creator of all of our particular health issues, from a Western world at least, with the chronic disease and things like that. And I often think, well, if everyone actually was just able to follow the guidelines, I wonder whether we'd still be in that position. But I think that just the way that things are set up makes it incredibly difficult to follow any sort of guidelines like that. So therefore, it's challenging. And also writing food guidelines for a population is challenging when you've got, so when you do have that sort of individual differences and the nuances and things like that.
Yeah, I fully think that if people follow the guidelines at a population level, we'd be much healthier in the US and other high income countries in New Zealand and the UK. But I think there is a lot of individual variation. There's a lot of ways to achieve a healthy diet and lifestyle, right? So, or one example of where maybe people kind of are upset with the guidelines is they don't really count for some of these more therapeutic diets, a ketogenic diet, for example.
Yeah.
That can be pretty healthy, right? That can help people lose weight. It can help them optimize a lot of their health markers. And I think that's a great strategy for a lot of people. Dietary guidelines aren't really suggesting keto diets, right?
No,
That's not really in there at
it's
this
usually
point.
at the end of the every year there's this review, and I wish I'm blanking on the magazine that puts it out, but you've always got the dash at the top, and you've got like keto down the bottom. Not that the dash isn't a quote unquote healthy approach. There's lots of amazing features of it with the vegetables and the fruit and things like that. But keto always bottoms out that list.
Right. So I think there's just some limitations with the guidelines, but certainly we're not following the guidelines. I mean, you look at the ultra processed food consumption in the US and the UK. I don't know what it is in New Zealand. I don't know what it is in Australia, but like most of the high income countries, it's upwards of 50% of our
Yeah.
calories. And so there's no wonder. It's not, I think there's that maybe in certain circles, there's sort of a lot of attention given to differences in perspective or at least kind of polarizing issues. But ultimately, it's like, I think you said it or you highlighted it simply like consume a diversity of minimally processed foods and limit ultra processed foods. It's just it doesn't have to be super complicated for most people. Of course, there's always exceptions, and those are some of the people with the loudest voices, right? Like, oh, I have this autoimmune condition, so I need to have a carnivore diet.
Yeah.
Right. Well, let's not take that to the population level and say everybody needs to eat that way, right? So, but again, like it's really about in general, there's a lot of simple guidance we can give people to eat, have minimally processed foods, and then getting into more optimization and for people who real like health gurus who have access to a lot of different things and supplements and everything. Then you can get into these really specific diets for sure.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, Ty, I'm interested to hear what you think, like with regards before we sort of just move on to your actual role in GAIN and things like that. But I think about the guidelines again as being guidelines for a healthy population. But of course, I think the most recent research was that 93% of the US could be considered metabolically unhealthy. And despite, I'm not sure what people's views are of New Zealand and Australia, but we're not that different, really. So I also wonder about I suppose, the applicability of something like that in a population which isn't actually healthy as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that study, over 90% of US adults having, metabolic issues is really, I think that's really concerning. And for sure, perhaps maybe the most problematic part of guidelines, like in the US, is this whole like grains consumption. Try to consume, several servings of grains a day. And they say make half your grains whole grain. Well, I'm not opposed to whole grains. I think some people have issues with them, but I think those can be really healthy in the right context. But you don't need to be consuming 60% of your calories from these starchy staples, and especially not the refined grains. And also in the guidelines, there's quite little on ultra processed foods, and so it's more about these food groups, and they sort of let slip this whole like refined carbohydrates getting mixed with polyunsaturated vegetable oils, which have, in the public health side, have these like really positive benefits. But of course, when you combine those refined starches or sugars and those refined fats, that's what our diet is. That's what these junk foods are that are really driving a lot of these metabolic conditions. And so, certainly, I think if I was able to just wave a wand and change the dietary guidelines, I would make some adjustments for sure. And I think that point is right. Like, if you're not metabolically healthy, you probably don't want to be consuming very many refined grains at all, right?
For sure. And I think it's really difficult for consumers to understand even the difference between whole grain and refined grain when you pick up a Cheerio cereal and it says made from whole grain. And I'm sort of like, well, at one point or another, it was a whole grain, way back in the processing chain. Like it's, there are, at least in New Zealand, there's not a lot of regulation, I suppose, around what food companies can say or not say about the things that they claim on a
Yeah, I
package.
fully agree. The thing that's really frustrating to me is this lack of distinction about whole grains and the level of processing. Like you have whole grains that are fresh, say oatmeal or whole wheat bread or millet or buckwheat or something, but then you have whole grains that are in these ultra processed cereals that are highly refined, that are really hyper palatable. People are over consuming these foods, and it's pretty clear that there's a difference on those in those two products, and that should be recognized, I think, by public health people.
Yeah, for sure. And, when we talk about metabolic health issues and non-communicable diseases, and what people are eating, I always think about nutrition as opportunity cost, because if they are filling up on the types of foods that we've just been talking about, then they're getting a lot less of the foods that they actually need that provide nutrients. And I know that that's a lot of what you look at, is the ability for people to get nutrients from food. So can we chat a little bit about your work in the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition? Can you just tell people what it is that you sort of look at, and then we can sort of delve into that micronutrient density piece?
Sure. So my organization, it's a global development organization, really focused on trying to improve access to nutritious and safe foods, and increasingly produced in sustainable ways. So we really care about, primarily we've been focused, our target audiences are usually in low and middle income countries, so sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia. But we really work globally, and a lot of the work that I do, I'm on the knowledge leadership team. We generate evidence, we try to learn from our programs so that we can have insights for ourselves and for others in the community. We try to answer questions that are preventing us from being able to administer proper programs, or investing in the right ways, or supporting the right policies. So we try to fill a lot of those information or evidence gaps. And that's kind of where a lot of my work comes in, is looking at, what is it? Is it something, trying to look at dietary patterns across the globe? What are people eating? How is that affecting their health? What are the micronutrients in these foods? Where are their gaps? And micronutrient deficiencies, and so on. And so it's been really, I think, helpful for me to feel like I can do research, but it's really focused on issues that are pressing and of pretty urgent need to address malnutrition. And so that's kind of where my focus has been, on global topics, and oftentimes, context specific issues in certain countries.
Yeah, and you mention the sort of malnutrition, and people don't often connect malnutrition with developed countries. And, historically, we think about the developing countries and their lack of access to, foods which actually have or provide those nutrients. Ty, can we, because I'd love to discuss the sort of issue in Western countries and the rest of it as well. But first, can we sort of, what defines a deficiency in your work? And is it just that it's not meeting the recommended dietary intake or allowance?
Yeah, maybe I can just clarify a few different sort of terms or ways to look at micronutrients or nutrients in general. So the first level is sort of the food supply. We have data from the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, that looks at, for every country, what are the foods that are being produced, imported, that are available for consumption. So there's a way you can analyze this, and we've done this, where you look at what's the adequacy of the food supply. It doesn't mean people are consuming those diets exactly, but it gives you a sense of what's there. A more nuanced, or a little bit better of a perspective when you have the data, is to look at dietary intakes. So these are like a 24-hour recall of, for the last 24 hours, somebody going through a trained interview looking at, okay, so what have you consumed over the past day and night? And you get to specific quantities, and you can estimate, what your usual intake is and what is your risk of inadequate intakes. When you talk about deficiency in my field or in global nutrition, you're really referring to biomarkers of micronutrient status. So these are like measurements in your blood or serum that can actually tell you what level of micronutrient you have in your blood. So if you're deficient, there are pretty commonly accepted cutoffs for deficiencies. So for B12, folate, vitamin A, zinc, iron, vitamin D, recently we had a paper come out yesterday where we're looking at these global deficiencies, and took a while to sort of find what are we going to use for the threshold. It's so complicated when you get into like, what are you going to, like, the assay used, so the test used in any context can be different.
Yeah.
The adjustment for inflammation, which can influence the prevalence quite a bit, can vary, and you don't always have access to the same type of data. It's not standardized across countries. So you have to make a lot of decisions along the way. But ultimately, deficiency is, in our view, is having too little of a certain nutrient in your body. And that's assessed with these biomarkers that you can say, okay, if your threshold at the population level or at the individual level, if you have less than this in your body, then you are at risk for these health consequences. And those can vary widely depending on how severe your deficiency is and what deficiency it is and what other insults you have, whether you're having repeated infections, if you have unsafe water. Nutrient deficiencies are going to take a bigger toll on you than if you're in a Western country with not as many insults that way. So I know it's a long answer to your question, but it's just getting at this, like, there's different levels of information.
Yeah.
And they don't always align either. So we try to make the most sense we can and try to triangulate data when we can to make inferences.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And, I've heard people talk about the fact that the requirements that we see in our nutrient sort of guidelines, they've been set like many decades ago in some cases, yet the sort of our environment has changed, our body size has changed. There's so many more people weigh a whole lot more now than what they would when they were sort of establishing the guidelines. So does that change what could be considered adequate? And then of course it's that term adequate as well. So we've got these sort of recommended dietary intakes, but in some instances some of them are so incredibly low, like protein, it might be enough to survive on but not necessarily sort of thrive on. So I'd sort of wonder, what are your thoughts around what we're told we need and what we potentially need? Have you sort of done any work in that, Ty?
Yeah, I think you make really good points. I would just say, for starters, that even when you use these sort of markers of what we consider adequate, not necessarily saying it's optimal, people are falling way short. So regardless of how you define it, there's a big issue. Like, people are not getting the nutrients they need. That's worldwide. It's in high income countries. It's in much higher and low and middle income countries, but it's happening. But I think the sort of issue around optimal values for protein, I'm not an expert, but I certainly am pretty convinced that the RDA, for example, in the US is not necessarily optimal for people.
Yeah.
There's a lot of reasons why you could potentially want to consume more than that. And I think for micronutrients, that could be the case for certain nutrients. There's also a risk of some nutrients. Having too much iron can be problematic, particularly heme iron, especially if your body's not great at regulating that, if you have any particular condition. So it's not always like more is better. There are upper limits. There are potential risks for that consumption. But I do think that there are probably levels of certain micronutrients that consuming above the recommended intake could be potentially beneficial for some people. And your point about body size, I don't know the answer to that, like whether larger body size means you necessarily you have higher requirements, but certainly it's possible and it would make sense. I do know that there is a lot of evidence that people who are overweight or obese often have much higher risk for deficiencies. So that could be because their body size and they have high requirements. It could be because they're eating more nutrient poor foods, more ultra processed foods. It's hard to know, but in general, when these RDAs are set, or the recommended nutrient intakes are set, they're already well above what the average requirement is. And the reason they have to do that is because when you look at a population level, if you just recommended the average nutrient requirement, and that's normally distributed, even on both sides of that distribution, half of the population would not get enough of the nutrient. And so what they do is they go 2 standard deviations above that for the recommended nutrient intake, which ends up being about 97% of the recommended intake. So it's going to cover basically the 98% of the population's requirements if you meet that target. And so for most people, it probably won't be a problem if you're getting the recommended nutrient intake, because it's already sort of designed to take in that variation of requirements, because everybody has different requirements depending on their individual factors.
Yeah.
But it also doesn't guarantee that you're going to have optimal levels, especially if you're an athlete or if you have certain goals that you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting, Ty, when I think about whether people are meeting their nutrient intakes, and I really want to talk about the paper that was just released yesterday as well. So, just in New Zealand, we have this study, and I think it's called the Cost of Living Study. And so, it's an organisation as part of the University of Otago. They calculate how much it costs for someone on a budget versus someone who can afford a little luxuries and a little more, and they determine the types of or how much it costs and the types of food you need to measure to meet the mark in terms of the recommended dietary intake. And for foods or for nutrients, like I know ones that you're interested in, like iron and zinc and B12, the amount of animal protein they recommend in these diets is actually really low, and the diet itself wouldn't meet these recommendations unless they included, as they do, a drink that we have here called Milo. And I'm not sure if you've heard of Milo.
Yeah.
Yeah, a Nestle drink, and it's fortified with all of these sort of nutrients. And I know that fortification absolutely has its place and is super valuable. But no, I have no idea about this. But do we know, is there any information on how well we utilize that, fortified products as much as what we would if they were in the food that you'd naturally find it in? Like, is there much information on that?
Yeah, so the form that the nutrient comes in affects the bioavailability or how much your body absorbs. It's not really the case that fortified nutrients in fortified foods are necessarily worse. They're not always worse than, in terms of bioavailability, but I should say they're less robust in ensuring your body regulates how much you need. So, and there's also a lot of synergistic interactions between nutrients and compounds, so even non-essential compounds that potentially impact the health or the way that you metabolize nutrients. So, I think that the evidence suggests getting most of your nutrients through foods, through, whole foods or foods that have intrinsic nutrients in them, I think is better for a few reasons. One of them is that adding nutrients through fortified foods to nutrient poor foods, you're not replicating the whole food. So there's thousands of compounds that are in that whole food that are potentially could have beneficial effects. We don't really know. We know that there are a lot of missing compounds in something like a highly refined product that has a handful of fortified nutrients. There's also some concern about excess if you have certain nutrients. For example, if you have a lot of iron through supplements or through fortified products, it can be risky to your body. Whereas if you have that iron in food, it's held within a food matrix and it can be less problematic. This is, the case if you have infection or if you have malaria. One of the reasons, when you're working in a lower and middle income country and you have interventions that fortify foods and provide supplements, those are really beneficial, but you also want to treat the malaria at the same time, because if you have this free iron in the bloodstream, it can actually exacerbate the infection.
Yeah, of
So
course.
those are sort of risks. It doesn't mean you can't use fortified products. You have to use them carefully, or supplements. You have to use them while treating, the infection if it's there. But yeah, my general sort of take is there's a lot of health benefits from foods beyond the handful of nutrients. So the other risk is, like we talked about ultra processed foods earlier. There really is a risk, given how much they're increasing globally, that if you just think the solution to deficiencies is only through fortification, we're just going to transition to come much more into the realm of obesity and diet-related non-communicable diseases. So diabetes, heart disease, cancer. And that's concerning. I think from a policy standpoint, I would like to see more fortification that takes place as a safety net. It's sort of behind the scenes. You're not necessarily telling consumers to eat unhealthy foods. For example, if you fortify salt, you fortify sugar, whatever it is that you're fortifying, you don't want to say, like, eat a bunch of cookies so that you get your nutrients, right? You want to, like, have that as a safety net, but you still want to have the messaging be consume these minimally processed foods for all these other reasons.
Yeah.
And then have that fortification there as a safety net.
Yeah, for sure. I think the only food guidelines that come to mind that seem to emphasize in a way that is very obvious the minimally processed sort of foods, in addition to, how to eat and the cultural aspects of eating and stuff, are the Brazilian guidelines, whereas in the US and in the UK and Australia and New Zealand, we're all variations of the same guidelines. It sort of feels like there's a little bit more sort of talk around that, but hasn't been a lot of necessarily change over the years with respect to what we're told.
I really do appreciate the Brazil guidelines. I'm glad you brought that up. They focus on food, they focus on peeling, right, as opposed to unwrapping. So they do try to get at the processing in a way that I think most dietary guidelines haven't. But I think that in the future, I think countries will be moving in that direction. I hope so.
It almost feels like there's no choice, because the same old obviously isn't working. So you'd hope that someone who is responsible or in that space will start making different decisions. Ty, can I ask you about your paper that was just released yesterday, as I saw on Twitter last night? So can we talk through so it was published in the Lancet, and you did find like a high percentage of people had more than one micronutrient deficiency, and it wasn't just in developing countries, it was in developed countries as well. So can you just chat us through what you did and some of the major highlights?
Sure. So we took a look at what data was out there to try to answer this question. And initially we were looking, I previously mentioned, we're looking at, there's food supply data that looks at what food is available for consumption. There's dietary intake data, and then there's this biomarker data. We originally tried to get into the world of diet data and proxy data because there's just not a lot of data on biomarkers for populations for micronutrient status. But we ended up having to shift away from that approach because the data just doesn't always line up. Like if you have an inadequacy in the diet, it doesn't mean you're going to have the same level in the biomarker. And so there's just so many factors that prevent that from really being a clear relationship. And so we just used biomarker data. So we had to compile this data. We had a partner at Emory, the Brinda collaboration, where they already had a bunch of data sets, 20 data sets or so. And we did search process for data. We contacted stakeholders and partners that we already knew of who had data to get access. It was this long process, but we obtained all this data. It was only about 24 data sets across the world, and that's not a huge number of data sets for a global estimate. We tried to standardize the approach. What biomarkers are we going to use? What thresholds are we going to use? What approaches for inflammation are we going to use, et cetera, so that we can have really kind of standard approaches, even though there's a lot of unknowns. So we have this question of, okay, well, nobody's really looked at globally, at least, at like the risk of any deficiency. It's usually what is the prevalence of vitamin A deficiency, iron deficiency, et cetera. So we had to try to find data sets where there were multiple biomarkers for different micronutrients in the same individuals, so we could really answer that question. Do you have a deficiency in vitamin A or iron or zinc? And so we ended up kind of narrowing it down. We had 6 or 7, we called them sentinel nutrients that we think, these are public health issue, they're lacking in a lot of populations. But then we didn't have enough data on all of those nutrients and all of those nutrients in the same individuals across countries. So we ended up selecting a core set of nutrients. So we looked at iron, zinc, and folate for women, and we looked at iron, zinc, and vitamin A for children. And that was because we had more data on those together. They're higher prevalence, or they're just really frequently measured across countries. So then we modeled what is the risk of any deficiency and tried to, estimate for some data gaps. So we got this sort of estimate at the regional level and the global level, and it was pretty shocking. Even though I was sort of expecting there to be high prevalence, 2/3 of women worldwide have at least one deficiency. It's more than half of the population, and just over half the population of preschool age children under 5 years of age have at least one deficiency. So this is 1 in 2 people at least worldwide are having these deficiencies. It's not a small issue. We also looked at the specific values in certain countries because we had data on specific countries. So many of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia had much higher prevalence. So 9 in 10 women in several of these countries were deficient in one or more micronutrients. I think what's perhaps even more surprising was in high income countries, how high of a prevalence we found. So in the UK, it was over half of women having at least one deficiency. In the US, it was about a third of women. Iron deficiency was 20%, a little over 20% in both the UK and the US for women. Zinc deficiency was over 10% in both countries. The folate and vitamin D deficiency in the UK was around 20%. So it's just pretty ubiquitous. Every country has these deficiencies. I think they're much more severe in the low and middle income country context. Because they're higher prevalence, there's a much higher risk of multiple micronutrient deficiencies. And there's a lot of other insults to people in those contexts, whether it's inadequate, like healthcare access, there's not clean water, you're exposed to infections and parasites. And so those issues kind of act synergistically to cause much greater health burdens. But I think there's no question that we have an issue worldwide. And I think if nothing else, this is a paper just for advocacy to say, look, we need to pay attention to nutrient density of foods. We need to pay attention to nutrient adequacy, even though in high income countries, a larger burden is from non-communicable diseases. We don't want to ignore that, but certainly we can't just pretend like everybody has all the nutrients they need. It's just not true.
Ty, do they intersect at all, like the nutrient deficiencies that you've highlighted and the issue with non-communicable diseases? So is it the same problem but manifested in a different way? I don't know.
There are certainly some risk from nutrient deficiencies to non-communicable diseases. It's not really my area of expertise, and honestly, there's not a lot of research that's been done on that, but there has been some, and I think there is a link. I think the solution really can be to improve healthy diets that address the nutrient inadequacies and the diet-related non-communicable disease risk. Really, when you shift to a diversity of minimally processed foods and you focus on nutrient-dense foods, you're going to be minimizing your risk for chronic diseases. There may be some trade-offs, like maybe having a larger share of plant-based foods can potentially reduce your risk for non-communicable diseases, but puts you at a little bit of an increase for nutrient deficiencies, and then vice versa. If you have more animal source foods, you can be at a greater protection of nutrient deficiencies, but perhaps slightly increased risk for non-communicable diseases. It depends.
Yeah.
But I would like to see this central approach that addresses both of those issues simultaneously.
Yeah, and I feel like particularly in New Zealand, at least, there is a focus on those NCDs and eat less, move more. And I'm not suggesting that that's not a good approach. It just hasn't worked to date. And so sort of shifting that narrative to actually, how can we increase our opportunity to eat these things which we know we need? Then by default, as you say, it's very difficult to get the same number of calories from the foods that are causing the potential sort of excess issues.
Yeah, I think it's pretty unfair to say eat less, move more, but we're going to make it a food environment that is, addictive, hyperpalatable foods that few people can resist. I mean, it's not really about willpower. It's not like a flaw in a person if they can't resist these foods. It's not like it's easy. Biologically, the food chemists are designing these foods so that we want them and we want to consume more, and the taste, the texture, everything about them. So yeah, I feel like it's a bit unfair when there's guidelines like that say just eat less and move more and you'll be fine.
Yeah.
Certainly, we know there are people who can eat whatever they want and stay really slim. And those people, for whatever reason, have certain genetics or characteristics that enable them to do that. It doesn't mean if somebody else can't do that they're just choosing the wrong foods or they're somehow like not capable. It's just really about it's a problem for certain people's genetics and their characteristics. And I think that's why we need at population level, we need to really consider this like a much more systematic way. How do we actually shift away from the addictive foods that are making us sick towards these more wholesome foods? And there's a tension there with industry and funding and profit. Profit margins are definitely much higher for ultra processed foods. Shelf life is much higher. Convenience, sometimes even affordability. So all of these factors play a role. And it's also like we have to work hard to make nutritious, healthy foods. We need them to be easy. We need to be quick, accessible, desirable, right? Like they have to appeal to social status and context. That's a lot to try to overcome, but I think it's definitely worthwhile pursuing those efforts because we can't just expect people to make all the right choices or have access to all the right foods, right? It's
Yeah.
just a challenge.
Yeah, for sure. And Ty, what are the implications of being deficient in these nutrients for the groups that you looked at, like the children and of course the was it women of reproductive age was the other group where you had quite good data for?
Yeah, so it's women of reproductive age, so that's about 15 to 49 years, and then children, preschool age children less than 5. So the consequences are pretty wide, like pretty diverse. So you can have anything from one, your immune system is reduced, so you have increased susceptibility to infections. There could be birth defects. So if a mother doesn't have enough folate, you can have the fetus can develop a neural tube defect that can be life-threatening or debilitating. There can be reduced growth and cognitive development. So in young children, a really critical age, especially when they first start eating solid foods at about 6 months to 23 months, they need a lot of really nutrient dense foods because their brain's rapidly developing, their body is, they're growing faster than any time in life. Adolescents also growing faster, second fastest growth velocity in life. There's a lot to show that there's actually decreased cognitive performance or school performance with deficiencies. So you're not performing as well in school. You can't think as clearly. You can't focus. There are severe effects, with vitamin A deficiency, like blindness, and ultimately, like work productivity, your economic potential, your human potential in general for what you can accomplish is really reduced. So it varies depending on the severity of the condition, whether you have multiple deficiencies, whether you have other morbidities at the same time. But it can be a serious issue. It's not just something to shrug off and say, well, who cares? Anemia is another consequence of iron, B12, folate deficiencies. Anemia can take away your energy. Severe anemia can be life-threatening. So these consequences can be severe. I also think we don't want to exaggerate and say, well, if everybody who has any sort of suboptimal level of micronutrient status, they're on their deathbed or something, right? Like it's not necessarily that's not the case, but there's some sort of happy medium of appreciating the severity and trying to say, okay, well, within reason, like there are other issues. It's not necessarily the end of the world if you have a deficiency, but let's also try to address it.
Yeah, for sure. And the things that you were talking about, they really speak to the intergenerational impact of the deficiencies, right? So if you've got women who are deficient in these nutrients who are then having children who sort of start life out deficient in an environment with a food supply that isn't necessarily ideal for being able to get those nutrients, and it's just this real flow-on effect, and it absolutely has health and economic and social consequences. Like it's it feels like that's a really obvious sort of story that is just being missed. I don't know, when you think about sort of public health nutrition.
Yeah, I mean, in my field, it's not missed. It's like what we focus on, right? There's even a word for it. It's the first 1,000 days. It's the year where you're a fetus and you're developing in the mother's womb, and then you're born, and then you have you're breastfeeding, and then you're getting access to these first complementary foods. But certainly, I think outside of my field, which is just a narrow niche, it's not appreciated. But you're absolutely right. Like even if you look at just the data on the stunting, so the short stature of a mother, the risk goes to more than twofold in general for that the child is going to be stunted. I mean, that's just like some a girl who's stunted at birth 20 years later gives birth to a kid. She's already at significantly increased odds of having poor health outcomes for the child. And so it is definitely an intergenerational issue, and that's kind of why it's so hard to break out of these cycles. It's not just like, well, you can at some point in your life, you're going to get the healthy foods you need. It's like, no, you need to have these during these critical periods of growth and reproduction, right? To make sure that you get started out in the right way. And these deficiencies are a big contributor to that intergenerational cycle of malnutrition.
Yeah, for sure. And stunting isn't just short stature, is it?
Yeah, so stunting really, the reason that stunting is used because it's easy to measure. It's quick and affordable, and it's a monitoring tool. We can look across countries and say, "Wow, stunting is pretty severe." There are a lot of actions that we know that need to be done to address this. But the more important issue than just the stunting is, they're both important. The physical growth constraint is a problem, but also the cognitive issues, the development, the psychosocial, all of these factors are sort of correlated. So it's both. It's the stunted growth, but it's also the lack of brain development, neurocognitive development during these critical stages where you're being set back from these deficiencies.
Yeah, yeah. And Ty, your a paper, and I think it was earlier this year that you published, which actually looked at the types of foods that we could be including that are actually really dense in these nutrients. Because a lot of people hear iron and zinc and they're like, well, I eat a lot of leafy greens or I have chicken. I know that I'm getting my micronutrients that I need, but oftentimes what's in food doesn't necessarily equate to what we can actually use. Can we talk a little bit about the sort of the priority foods that list that you've done research on that sort of ranks foods looking at both bioavailability and nutrient status?
Yeah. So I think that's a good point. Like chicken's a really interesting one because if you're sort of a proponent of some animal source foods or moderate animal source foods or whatever, chicken usually is like, okay, it's pretty good. Like, chicken and fish are given pretty clean pass compared to say beef or something. But they're not as, chicken's not that dense in nutrients compared to beef or compared to some of these other foods. So when you look really, the exception to that is the liver or the organs of the chicken or other poultry. Those are super dense. So in general, organ meats like liver, spleen, kidney, heart, and various animals are the most nutrient dense foods. That's pretty clear. They contain high quantities of nutrients. They're bioavailable forms of those nutrients. Small fish, so when they're consumed with the bones and skin, they're very nutrient dense. Dark green leafy vegetables are nutrient dense, but I think that's important to recognize. Like it depends on the nutrients. So the great sources of vitamin A,
Yeah.
good source of iron. They're not the most bioavailable iron, but it's still good. They're a good source of calcium.
Yeah.
The bioavailability of calcium is pretty similar across most dark green leafy vegetables compared to say dairy. There are some exceptions. I think in the U.S., one study showed that spinach had very low bioavailability of calcium, around 5%. But for the most part, most dark leafy greens are great sources. Bivalves, so these are like clams, mussels, oysters, super nutrient dense. The problem is they're pretty expensive in a lot of contexts. I don't even eat them very regularly because of that reason. So crustaceans like crab, lobster, shrimp, those are also nutrient dense. And then you have the beef, the goat. These are sort of the ruminant meat, eggs, milk, and even canned fish. When you have something like canned salmon or mackerel, or even a larger fish, but it has the bones and the skin preserved in there, it's very nutrient dense. And we also have, I think the study also showed mutton and lamb, which is another, that's also ruminant meat. So those are the top sources. Other sources, um, other dairy products, just fresh fish in general, pulses, which are these also called legumes, lentils, beans, peas. Those are pretty dense, and then certain traditional grains. So maybe not as common. Quinoa is the more common one in the West, but teff, millet, sorghum, fonio, these contain pretty high densities of minerals as well and folate. So those are the foods. You don't really see those always promoted. I mean, animal source foods, when you get into the discussion around environmental impact, they get a bad rap, and there's a big concern around their sustainability. So I think there's sort of this tension of, well, we know the top sources of foods to meet micronutrient needs are largely animal sourced, in addition to dark leafy greens. How do we do that sustainably? Also, how do we optimize your non-communicable disease risk with that effort to try to meet micronutrient needs? And I think the perspectives will go all over the place on that, right? Some people think that you need to minimize animal source foods. Others think you need to just eat as much as you want. But I think there's some balance there where we want to have enough and not too much for other reasons.
Yeah, for sure. And certainly the message out there in the public health really is to reduce consumption of the animal products that do have a lot of these, really important micronutrients that we need and that we can actually access. Because with some of the other foods, even the ones that you listed, what is the potential impact of some of those, what people call anti-nutrients, or factors that might change our absorption factor? So how much of a difference does that make?
It makes a big difference. I think this is underappreciated in the plant-based community. I can give you some examples from our study. So in this analysis, which I just mentioned the kind of results of, we looked at the bioavailability differences for iron and zinc. Not everybody knows this, but vitamin A already sort of accounts for these differences in the requirement. So it's called a retinol activity equivalent when you have a carotenoid from a plant food. It's about a 12-to-1 ratio that's assumed. Iron and zinc don't have that. So most studies, they just don't adjust because it's too complicated. We say, well, we know that external factors, the total diet, individual variation influences absorption and bioavailability. So it's hard to estimate. Well, for us, it's like the risk of not adjusting is actually far greater than the uncertainty of how exactly bioavailability is impacted on average. So we adjusted for iron and zinc. And, we looked at the amount of heme iron in foods. We looked at the amount of phytate, which is one of the key anti-nutrients when you think of compounds in foods, plant source foods that inhibit absorption of minerals. So ruminant meat like beef, we estimate is about the iron bioavailability is about twice as high as that in plant source foods. So dark green leafy vegetables or beans or lentils or peas. So if you have an equivalent portion, say 2 milligrams in the serving of iron, only half of that, has half the bioavailability if it comes from that plant source versus an animal source. For zinc, it's about 70% higher for animal sources, depending on the source, compared to the best sources in plant source foods, which are these beans, peas, lentils. They're really high in phytate. And as an example of this, some of your listeners may have heard of the Eat Lancet report or the planetary health diet approach. This is sort of this highly plant-based diet, about 14% of calories from animal source foods, their recommended one, but as low as 0%. We looked at this from a nutrient adequacy perspective and a phytate perspective, which is that key anti-nutrient. And the diet that's recommended has about 2,500 milligrams to 3,000 milligrams of phytate, which is sort of off the charts. We don't really even know what that does because in dietary guidelines, we have 4 different cutoffs for zinc, recommended zinc intakes that are adjusted based on how refined your diet is and how much phytate's in there.
Yeah.
So the estimate is for 300 milligrams of phytate all the way up to 1,200 milligrams. So you get the lowest bioavailability with a diet that has 1,200 milligrams. Well, this is 2 to 3 times that amount. That's going to have an effect on bioavailability. We just don't really know how much, but we know it's significant. So in general, if you can try to level for the bioavailability, you can get a better sense. And that's why our results really kind of show the potential and the value of animal source foods because they're accounting for that difference in bioavailability.
As I understand it, was liver up there, like one of the liver and spleen and the organs, were they off the charts amazing in terms of those nutrients, even compared to the more commonly consumed beef or of people who eat meat? There's quite a difference even there, isn't there?
Yeah, one of the metrics that we used was I suppose it's the metric, was this metric where we look at what is the quantity of grams or calories to meet an average of a third of the recommended intakes of these 6 nutrients. So iron, zinc, calcium, folate, B12, and vitamin A. And when you do that, you get a variable portion size that will meet that same equivalent. And that's just kind of a proxy to say, okay, we're leveling these foods that we know how they compare. Well, when you look at liver, for example, and this is combined liver from different animals, it takes only 11 calories or 7 grams to meet that average of 1/3 of these recommended intakes. It's very small, right? It's just a tiny amount that you would have to eat to get those nutrients. It goes up when you get to other animal source foods, dark green leafy vegetables. So for dark green leafy vegetables, 72 calories and 239 grams. So quite a bit of, a big salad there. When you get up to some of these foods that are considered, have been considered nutrient dense or nutritious before, I mean, the values can go off the charts. So if you look at, even if you look at pulses, so these are beans, peas, and lentils, you have 667 calories are required to make that same amount, and
to meet
499 grams.
Okay, to meet 1/3 of your
1/3, an average of a third of the recommended intakes. When you go to chicken, it takes over 1,000 calories, almost 500 grams. Other fruits, so these are the non-vitamin A rich fruits. It takes over 1,000 calories, almost 2,000 grams.
Goodness.
And then when you look at even whole grains, so whole grains, they're not recommended for their high nutrient density necessarily. They're for their potential benefits for non-communicable disease risk. But in terms of the micronutrients that are commonly lacking, it takes almost 2,000 calories and 1,000 grams of whole grains to meet that 1/3 of requirements. So this gives you a sense of the magnitude of the differences. And it also, I think, is encouraging from a sense that if you focus on the most micronutrient animal source foods, organ meats, small fish, bivalves and other shellfish, even beef and eggs to some extent, and dairy, you don't have to consume huge amounts to help to contribute big amounts of these bioavailable nutrients. And even just consuming some increases the bioavailability of other nutrients. So it's kind of it's a lot of benefit for a small amount of consumption. And I think that is, an important message, even for, let's say that you sort of the view that we need to minimize animal source foods for environmental or ethical or whatever reason. I think it's at a population level, we should really still care about trying to have at least a moderate amount of consumption of these really nutrient dense animal source foods, because we know half of the population is deficient in at least one nutrient. And this is going to go a long way, just trying to ensure access to these foods. And that's, what my organization GAIN does, is we try to improve access to these nutritious foods, and we try to do that in a sustainable way. And so in certain contexts, like in Mozambique, we have a program where animal source food consumption is actually pretty low, and we're trying to increase it sustainably with some key foods. And we know from evidence on intervention studies and trials that providing animal source foods like an egg, for example, can actually improve child growth and nutrient adequacy.
Yeah. Is it the is that the trial where families are given like chickens to be able to have eggs for the family? Is that the same one that you're talking about?
There's been a few. There's one, the one that's kind of the most compelling was in Ecuador. It's called the Williden project. And they gave young children, I think it was 6 to 23 months, it could have been under 5 years of age, they gave them 1 egg a day. So they actually provided the egg. There's been many other trials where you provided chicken or livestock also. But when you provide them, you can actually more likely ensure that they're going to eat them with this food. You give them nutrition education on top of that. And there was a significant improvement in cognitive outcomes and in child growth. There was a study in Kenya that did this for, I think, adolescents, where it was different animal source foods were added, and there was a significant improvement. So you can get these improvements through, to some extent, through fortified foods or supplements during critical stages. But it's important to just notice um, there are a lot of challenges with trying to just meet everybody's need through supplements, and it's part of the solution. But so are animal source foods, from my perspective.
Yeah, for sure. And just clinically speaking, when I talk to people about their diet, I know that they have a much easier time adhering to sort of principles that I promote, which is a higher protein, fresh vegetables, a lot of fiber, when they actually do have a decent amount of protein in their diet, even, probably more than what is, definitely more than what is recommended by the RDI, just because hunger is then taken care of. So they're not drawn to the type of hyperpalatable foods that are just so readily available.
Yeah, I think there's a satiety factor that is important. I think protein and fiber, water content in general can really contribute to, right? So, yeah, I fully agree.
Yeah. Ty, finally, I know you're a dad. Do you despair at the diets of children that you see around you? I mean, I know obviously you're not going to make judgment or anything like that, but I'm pretty sure I saw a tweet from you a few months ago that showed sort of the type of food that was being served in maybe the school or the kindergarten of where your children went. Do you sort of ever think more widely of children in America and other Western nations, and just despair at what's being recommended that they eat?
Yeah, I certainly do. I think the U.S. is actually probably far worse than most other high-income countries when you look at school meals. I've had some colleagues reach out about their meals in Italy and Switzerland, about how healthy their school meals are, and I'm certainly jealous. So I want to say for starters that there is an issue of food security even in the U.S. and school meals, for many families, school meals are still healthier or better than what they're going to get at home. They may not even have access to enough food at home. There's a lot of reasons. They also keep kids in school globally in different contexts. So I'm not against school meals. I recognize that it's hard to provide incredibly healthy meals at low cost and that are perishable and all that. But I'm pretty disappointed and discouraged in the foods that are being served and that are part of the national strategy. So, as an example, these are oftentimes ultra processed foods. My daughter, who's 5 now, she has had, and now I send her with lunch, but for breakfast she's had cinnamon rolls, which are whole grain, but they're pretty much just full of sugar and highly processed. I heard her mention pancakes before. These sugary breakfast cereals, um, sandwiches with turkey or ham, like processed meat sandwich, but with no vegetables. I mean, I think she's gone a day at school where there's no vegetables or fruits that she's consumed because it's just like wasn't required or whatever. It's up to the child to choose. The other thing is chocolate milk and strawberry milk. These were the options. So if a 5-year-old or older, any kid goes into a cafeteria and they can have regular milk, strawberry milk, or chocolate milk, what are they going to choose?
I know, right?
Most of them are going to choose the sweet milk, right? And so that's not really ethical, like from my perspective. We shouldn't be making these options of really unhealthy foods. And I know, I think a harder part for me is they're promoted as healthy foods. We have healthy foods here. We follow the guidelines, and that's where I think your sort of comment about what are these guidelines. You can follow the guidelines and actually slip under the radar with unhealthy foods. The cinnamon roll, probably. I mean, I don't know. It seems like for one, school meals don't actually follow the guidelines. They have much too high amounts of added sugar. But whole grains are part of that. So you can say, look, you're just getting a good serving of whole grains.
Yeah.
But it's still junk food, and it's not going to help them focus at school. I've noticed it disrupts their ability to enjoy and appreciate healthier foods.
Yeah.
Like when you have these really appealing textures and combination of starch and fat and sugar and salt and flavorings. My girls would come home and they're just not going to eat without a lot of work. They're not going to eat the healthier options because it affects your body. Like even your microbiome can really influence the foods that you desire. So it takes, if you don't have those options, you just eat minimally processed foods, your body will be more used to those, and I think it's easier to consume those regularly. When you have a lot of junk food regularly, then you want more sugar in things. You want things to be sweeter. You want more flavor. You want things to give you that sort of high after you have it. That's just super appealing. So, in short, I'm very disappointed. I would love to be able to advocate for better school meals, especially in the U.S. I'm not a policy expert, but I would surely love to be able to find ways to help contribute to that effort.
Yeah, it's interesting what you've said about the fact that they are sort of quote unquote healthy according to the guidelines, whereas it just really highlights the issue that people have, whereas they look to the guidelines and they look to food guidance systems to be able to inform them making better decisions for their family, yet if this is what we're told is healthy, then how would they know? They don't necessarily have access to the knowledge and education that other people who would know that they were healthy or unhealthy. So I think that's super challenging.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Ty, thank you so much for your time this morning. I really appreciate having the opportunity to chat to you, and I appreciate the work that you and your other members of your team at GAIN are putting out there. And it's encouraging to sort of have these conversations, because I think these are, and with advocates for a better way of doing things, because change has to start somewhere. So I really appreciate you taking the time to chat to me and my listeners. Are you able just to tell us where people can find more information about or from you, particularly? Is it Twitter is the best place to sort of get access to the things that you're working on?
Yeah. So I'm most active on Twitter. So my handle is Ty R Beal. That's TYRBEAL. And I'll post research and other findings I find interesting. If you want to check out GAIN, it's gainhealth.org. And you can see programs and news articles and blogs on there. And so you can get a sense of what we do. But absolutely, if you ever have any, if any listeners want to send me a message, you can feel free to share on social media. My emails, you can find my email if you search on Google or if you go to the GAIN website. So, yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Ty, and I'll pop links to that in the show notes. So enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks so much for having me, Mikki. It was a pleasure.
Alrighty, hopefully you enjoyed that. What a wealth of information, and I love that there is more emphasis and awareness put to food quality, the way that him and his team are sort of putting out there, and it really does dispel some misconceptions about where you find nutrients in food. Next week on the podcast, I talk to Professor Howard Schubiner all about the role of the brain in our experiences of pain. Until then, you can catch me over on Facebook at Mikki Williden Nutrition, over on Twitter and Instagram at Mikki Williden, and on my website mikkiwilliden.com, where in addition to the recipe portal access, you can sign up to any one of my meal plans or book a one-on-one consult with me. All right, team, you have a great week. See you next week.